King Tut's reign was about 1330 BC. At that time, King Tut's dagger was a very important piece.
In the afterlife, King Tut was charged with the very important mission of assisting the sun god Ra.
In 1922, deep beneath the arid sands of the Valley of the Kings, a sealed doorway was breached, and with it, history was forever changed. When British archaeologist Howard Carter peered into the dimly lit chamber and declared he saw wonderful things, the world was plunged into a frenzy of fascination. What lay inside was not just a treasure trove of gold and priceless artifacts, but the virtually untouched tomb of a boy king, Tutankhamun, preserved for over 3 millennia. Yet what began as an unprecedented archaeological triumph soon took a darker turn due to a deadly curse. Now, over a century later, we finally know why 13 people died shortly after opening King Tut's tomb. This is one story you wouldn't want to miss. Let's get started. The Curse of the Pharaohs. In the winter of 1922, British archaeologist Howard Carter, funded by aristocrat Lord George Herbert Carnarvon, uncovered one of the most extraordinary archaeological finds in modern history: the tomb of Tutankhamun in Egypt's Valley of the Kings. The boy king, who ruled during the 18th dynasty and died at just 18 or 19 years of age around 1323 BCE, had lain undisturbed for over 3,000 years. His burial chamber, when finally breached on November 26, 1922, revealed an unprecedented cache of funerary treasures, over 5,000 objects, many made of gold or inlaid with lapis lazuli, carnelian, and turquoise. Yet the tomb's allure was soon eclipsed by the curse of the pharaohs that took root after a series of untimely deaths among those associated with the excavation. The first and most infamous fatality attributed to the so-called curse was Lord Carnarvon himself. On April 5, 1923, just 5 months after entering the tomb, he died in Cairo at the age of 57. Reports circulated that at the moment of his death, the lights went out across Cairo, and his dog, back in England, let out a wail and collapsed. Newspapers seized on the coincidence, and headlines around the world began to frame the tragedy as evidence of a deadly ancient malediction. But the curse did not stop here. Following Carnarvon's death, other names began to emerge. Arthur Cruttendon Mace, a member of Carter's excavation team and author of several early reports on the tomb, died in April 1928, just 5 years after the discovery, from arsenic poisoning compounded by pleurisy. Then came Sir Archibald Douglas Reed, the radiologist who had examined Tutankhamun's mummy via X-ray in 1925. Even members of Carnarvon's family were not spared the gossip. His half-brother, Aubrey Herbert, died in September 1923, just a few months after Carnarvon. Perhaps the most dramatic incident associated with the curse involved Prince Ali Kamel Fahmy Bey, a member of the Egyptian royal family. He was not directly linked to the excavation, but he died under violent circumstances in 1923, shot dead by his French wife, Marguerite Alibert, at the Savoy Hotel in London. Though unrelated to the tomb, the timing of his death and his royal lineage fed the growing media frenzy around the idea of a vengeful ancient force at work. In total, by the early 1930s, at least 13 people associated in varying degrees with the tomb's discovery had died. Newspapers such as the New York Times and Daily Express thus cemented the myth of the curse in public consciousness. One of the most quoted claims came from Marie Corelli, a British novelist who warned shortly after the tomb's opening that dire punishment would fall on anyone who violated a pharaoh's resting place. Her words, though fictional, added dramatic flair to what had already become a captivating narrative. The interwar years were marked by public fascination with the occult, spiritualism, and exotic tales from far-off lands. The mystery and mystique of ancient Egypt, especially following the discovery of a nearly untouched royal tomb, provided perfect fodder for a population hungry for wonder and perhaps distraction from the traumas of the First World War. The press played a major role in this, with foreign correspondents often embellishing or outright inventing eerie details to boost circulation. However, the most fascinating aspect of the whole thing is how durable the myth remains, even a century later. The idea of the curse of the pharaohs has seeped into popular culture, inspiring films, novels, documentaries, and endless internet speculation. The allure of the curse endures. So what is the reality behind all of these tragedies? Well, before we answer that, let's get all our facts in line. A tomb of oddities and questions. When British archaeologist Howard Carter and his patron Lord Carnarvon discovered the tomb of Tutankhamun in Egypt's Valley of the Kings in November 1922, they expected to find the grandeur and architectural scale associated with the great pharaohs of Egypt's new kingdom. Instead, they uncovered a surprisingly modest and cramped burial site, more like a repurposed storeroom than the final resting place of a king. Measuring just over 120 square meters in total, the tomb was far smaller than those of rulers like Ramesses II or Seti I, whose elaborate subterranean complexes extended for hundreds of meters and included long corridors, multiple chambers, and intricate wall art detailing journeys into the afterlife. Tutankhamun's tomb had just 4 rooms, 2 of which were barely large enough to hold the overflow of burial goods. The location itself also raised eyebrows. The boy pharaoh's final resting place is tucked away in a relatively low-lying, inconspicuous part of the valley, nestled below the tomb of Ramesses VI. This odd placement saved it from grave robbers over the centuries, as the construction of later tombs buried its entrance beneath rubble. But it also diverged from the usual practice of positioning royal tombs in prime locations, oriented for symbolic alignment with celestial and spiritual principles. Egyptian theology placed heavy emphasis on joining ancestors in the afterlife, especially for royalty, whose tombs were often aligned with the path of the sun god Ra, or clustered to facilitate a spiritual reunion with other divine kings. Tutankhamun's tomb stood apart, physically and metaphorically. Further clues within the burial chamber point to an unorthodox and possibly rushed interment. The walls were hastily painted in a yellow ochre background with minimalist scenes, lacking the fine detail and extensive inscriptions typical of 18th dynasty royal burials. Conservation studies by the Getty Conservation Institute in recent years have confirmed that the wall paintings were applied over wet plaster, causing microbial growth soon after the tomb was sealed. This practice was rare and suggested that the artisans worked under severe time pressure. Even more telling were the anomalies in the burial equipment. Among the more than 5,000 artifacts catalogued from the tomb, many appeared to be reused, modified, or even mismatched. Several items bore the names and titles of other individuals that had been hastily scratched out and replaced with Tutankhamun's cartouche. Gold inlays were swapped, inscriptions re-engraved, and fittings awkwardly adapted to new purposes. This was improvisation at the highest level during the final stages of Tutankhamun's burial. Nowhere is the evidence of this rushed burial more dramatic than in the nested coffins and sarcophagus that held the young pharaoh's body. Tutankhamun was interred in 3 nested coffins, each fitting inside the next like a gilded puzzle. The outermost and innermost coffins were consistent with a royal commission for Tutankhamun himself, but the middle coffin has puzzled Egyptologists for decades. Made of gilded wood and inlaid with colored glass and semi-precious stones, it bears stylistic and inscriptional features suggesting it was originally crafted for a female ruler, likely Neferuaten, a shadowy figure from the late Amarna period whose identity remains hotly debated. Neferuaten is widely believed to have been either Nefertiti, the powerful queen and co-regent of Akhenaten, or Meritaten, his daughter. After Akhenaten's death, around 1336 BCE, Egypt was in political turmoil, and the short reigns that followed were part of a larger effort to restore religious orthodoxy and undo the legacy of the Amarna heresy. Tutankhamun ascended the throne at around 8 or 9 years of age, during a period when legitimacy and stability were in short supply. Reusing Neferuaten's burial materials may have been a practical decision to expedite his burial or a symbolic act of erasing the memory of Amarna rulers by repurposing their funerary items. The face on the middle coffin, a delicate, soft-featured visage, does not resemble the iconic androgynous face depicted on Tutankhamun's death mask or the other two coffins. Scholars such as Dr. Nicholas Reeves and Dr. Aidan Dodson have argued that the gendered features, inscriptions, and anomalies in craftsmanship strongly suggest the coffin was not originally intended for a male monarch. Further supporting this theory is the presence of grammatical errors in the inscriptions, such as feminine pronouns later changed to masculine ones, indicating a hurried attempt to alter the coffin for Tutankhamun's use. In addition to the middle coffin's questionable provenance, the entire sarcophagus setup had structural inconsistencies. The stone sarcophagus itself appears to have been adjusted. Protruding corner elements were visibly cut down to accommodate the altered coffin dimensions. This kind of modification would have been unnecessary if the components had been commissioned together, implying instead that the pieces were assembled in haste, using whatever was available. Even the handles of the inner coffin showed signs of having been chiseled down post-production to fit inside the stone casing. The death mask, arguably the most famous artifact in the tomb, also displays hints of being made for someone else. Although it bears the cartouche of Tutankhamun on its shoulders, the inlaid gold and lapis nemes headdress has markings and ear piercings typical of female burials from the 18th dynasty. This, again, has led some experts to speculate that the mask was repurposed from an Amarna queen, likely Nefertiti or Neferuaten. Recent X-ray fluorescence, or XRF analysis, conducted by the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, has revealed a mismatch in the gold alloy composition between the face and the rest of the mask, suggesting that even this iconic object may have been assembled from parts originally belonging to two different items. All of these points relate to a larger historical context. Tutankhamun's unexpected death around 1323 BCE, possibly from malaria compounded by a leg fracture and congenital complications, would have left little time for preparing a royal tomb and grave goods from scratch. The normal mummification process, typically lasting 70 days, may have been shortened. In fact, the body had been badly charred due to chemical reactions from the embalming oils interacting with oxygen in a sealed space, causing a spontaneous combustion-like effect that essentially cooked the mummy over time. Even the burial timing raises questions. Astronomical calculations suggest that the funeral may have occurred in haste to coincide with the Shemu season, the third season in the ancient Egyptian calendar associated with harvest and the setting sun, a symbolic but narrow time window. If Tutankhamun died unexpectedly, and especially if he died far from the capital, as some theories propose, this could have left officials scrambling to secure his burial in time to align with religious protocol. There's also the issue of succession. Tutankhamun left no surviving heirs. His two mummified stillborn daughters were found in his tomb, and his widow, Ankhesenamun, appears to have attempted to secure the throne by writing to the Hittite king Suppiluliuma I, asking him to send one of his sons to marry her and rule Egypt, a plea that was intercepted and led to the prince's assassination. Ultimately, the General Ai, a former advisor and likely non-royal, took power and conducted Tutankhamun's burial. Ai's name is suspiciously present on some of the funerary items, such as a garland on the body, which may suggest that he co-opted the funeral for his own political gain, possibly even using Tutankhamun's tomb due to the absence of a prepared burial for himself. From the cramped layout and altered artifacts to repurposed coffins and signs of haste, the burial of Tutankhamun seems to have been assembled as a stopgap solution during one of ancient Egypt's most turbulent periods. In life, he was a minor king, attempting to restore traditional values after his father's heretical reign. In death, his hurried burial reflects the unfinished nature of his short reign. Yet, ironically, this humble patchwork tomb would become the most famous in Egyptian history. After all, can anyone name a tomb more iconic than that of King Tut's? Disrespect in death. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922 by Howard Carter remains one of the most extraordinary archaeological events in history. But the deeper scholars probed, the clearer it became that this was no ideal royal burial. As noted earlier, while the sheer quantity of grave goods and the intact seal initially stunned the world, there were subtle signs that the burial was hastily arranged, improvised, and in many respects, deeply irregular. Among the most startling finds was the presence of broken fragments from a statue of Osiris, particularly the toes, discovered inside the pharaoh's quartzite sarcophagus. An otherwise sacred and symbolically structured space meant to preserve the divine body of the deceased king. In Egyptian theology, Osiris was the archetype of divine kingship and posthumous renewal. Statues representing him were venerated and placed strategically to secure safe passage for the dead through the underworld. Finding parts of his statue, not placed with ritualistic care, but instead shoved unceremoniously among burial wrappings, suggests more than mere carelessness. It implies that items were added last minute, forcefully, or without ritual supervision, breaking cardinal rules of ancient Egyptian mortuary customs. Such disregard for the correct positioning and sanctity of sacred iconography was not typical in a royal interment. Modern forensic research, including a 2005 CT scan project led by Dr. Zahi Hawass and colleagues, found evidence of a compound fracture in the left leg, potentially sustained just days before death, alongside signs of malaria tropica, the most severe form of the disease. These two factors likely contributed to a rapid decline. No records suggest that the young king had a successor or pre-planned funerary arrangements. This lack of preparation may have forced the court to scramble for a suitable burial option. Tutankhamun's tomb itself bears architectural evidence of being repurposed. Compared to the grandiose, multi-corridor tombs of rulers like Thutmose IV or Seti I, which sprawl deep into the cliffs of the Valley of the Kings, King Tut's tomb is exceptionally modest. It consists of only 4 rooms: the antechamber, annex, burial chamber, and treasury, with a total floor area of just 120 square meters, significantly smaller than any other known New Kingdom royal tomb. Scholars, including Dr. Nicholas Reeves, have argued that the tomb was originally intended for someone of lower status. Its abrupt termination and rough finishing in certain areas support this theory. For instance, parts of the tomb show tool marks and unpainted sections, indicating that construction was either halted or redirected hastily to accommodate a royal burial. This theory gains further support from the peculiar orientation of the tomb. Unlike most royal tombs that follow a rightward turn into the burial chamber, symbolizing the journey into the underworld, King Tut's tomb turns left, a design typically associated with queens rather than kings. The iconography in the burial chamber, while royal in content, is also curiously minimalist and lacks the comprehensive religious texts that usually adorn a pharaoh's tomb walls. The wall paintings were executed in haste, with some areas showing signs of microbial damage caused by trapped moisture from wet paint. Researchers from the Getty Conservation Institute confirmed that the fungi and bacteria bloomed within weeks of the tomb's ceiling. Adding to the confusion was the sheer disorder within the tomb. Howard Carter's original notes and photographs document how many of the funerary objects appeared to be haphazardly arranged. Items were stacked, leaning against walls, or piled on top of each other, not arranged in the symmetrical, carefully curated fashion seen in other royal burials. In the annex, objects such as ceremonial shields, chariots, and provisions for the afterlife were found crammed into a small space with no apparent order. Carter himself described the scene as resembling a hastily rifled warehouse, rather than a solemn repository of a king's passage to eternity. Some of the most sacred objects, including canopic shrines and embalming tools, were poorly placed or grouped incorrectly, a breach of religious protocol. The sheer volume of grave goods also overwhelmed the small tomb, increasing the likelihood of hasty packing. Over 5,000 objects were catalogued, a number unparalleled in any other New Kingdom tomb. This profusion while extraordinary, made the careful arrangement of items almost impossible in the cramped space, leading to further disorder. The placement of broken Osiris statues in the sarcophagus, rather than carefully at the foot or near the canopic shrine, as tradition dictated, reflects the last-minute chaos and disregard for convention. Whether these broken pieces were meant to symbolize something or were simply tossed in to check a box remains uncertain, but the lack of respect towards such sacred symbolism is unmistakable. Another point of concern is the absence of a mortuary temple dedicated solely to Tutankhamun. Almost all pharaohs of the New Kingdom had temples constructed on the west bank of the Nile near Thebes, which served as cult centers to maintain their memory and receive offerings. No such structure has been definitively identified for Tutankhamun, although it is possible that portions of his cult were absorbed into that of the courtier-turned-pharaoh who succeeded him. I may have not only presided over Tutankhamun's burial, but also used the occasion to bolster his own legitimacy. One of the floral collars found on the mummy bears I's name, suggesting he inserted himself ceremonially into the burial, perhaps as a political maneuver. The lack of elaborate funerary texts and charms typically buried with pharaohs also adds to the impression of an incomplete or rushed burial. While over 100 figurines, which are servant statues meant to perform labor in the afterlife, were recovered, many were of lesser quality and smaller scale. The Amduat, Book of Gates, and Litany of Ra, which decorated the walls of other 18th dynasty kings' tombs, were entirely absent. Instead, the limited decorative program in the burial chamber shows only the most basic scenes: the opening of the mouth ceremony, and images of Tutankhamun with deities such as Osiris, Anubis, and Hathor. Despite these breaches in ritual decorum and the apparent disrespect in execution, it would be incorrect to assume that Tutankhamun was unloved or forgotten. His burial, though flawed, still involved the mobilization of immense resources. The gold, the imported cedar, the inlaid faience, and the sheer manpower required to carve, gild, and carry thousands of objects demonstrate that he was still honored as a pharaoh. Yet, the cracks in the process reveal the vulnerabilities of a court caught off guard, likely under pressure from looming succession questions and an unstable political backdrop. The puzzling mummy. From the moment Tutankhamun's mummy was first examined, it became clear that something about his burial was deeply unusual. Modern CT scans and genetic tests conducted between 2005 and 2010, led by Dr. Zahi Hawass and an Egyptian-German team, revealed a young man afflicted with multiple congenital and health-related conditions. He suffered from a flat right foot and a clubbed left foot due to a bone disorder known as Kohler disease 2, and there were indications of vascular bone necrosis, which would have significantly weakened his bones. These ailments likely forced him to rely on walking aids, perhaps explaining the presence of the 350 ornate canes found in his tomb, though some scholars note that canes also served as symbols of royal status. The genetic tests also confirmed that Tutankhamun had suffered from malaria tropica, the most severe form of the disease, and even suggested he had contracted multiple strains over time. Combined with a compound fracture in his left leg, likely acquired just before death, as suggested by the embedding of embalming substances into the wound, these conditions paint the picture of a pharaoh weakened physically by illness and injury. Though malaria may have introduced complications like septic shock, it was the fracture, possibly infected, that likely triggered a rapid, fatal decline. Yet the most compelling theory for Tutankhamun's death came from Dr. Chris Naunton and a team of forensic experts who conducted a virtual autopsy using CT scans and crash reconstructions. They observed a pattern of severe injuries on the left side of his skeleton, including broken ribs, crushed pelvis, and damaged chest, but no heart or sternum was present. Investigators concluded these marks were consistent with a chariot wheel accident, positing that Tutankhamun may have been struck at speed, resulting in internal trauma and possibly the destruction or removal of his heart. Intriguingly, Egyptian mummification practices nearly always preserved the heart, considered the seat of one's soul and intellect. Its absence in Tut's body is unprecedented and mystifying. The heart may have been destroyed during the chariot accident or improperly treated during the hurried embalming, but such an omission was unthinkable in proper royal ritual. The burial itself bore all the hallmarks of panic and haste. Carter's notebooks describe how 2 buckets of unguents, which were dense mixtures of oils, resins, and beeswax, were poured over the body before wrapping. However, the usual 70-day drying period of natron was likely shortened. The resins were still wet when the mummy was sealed. This oversight had profound consequences. Chemical analyses, including electron microscopy carried out by Dr. Robert Connolly in the 1960s, revealed that Tut's flesh was carbonized, blackened in a way consistent with burning. Investigators from the Building Research Establishment in Watford recreated the embalming conditions by saturating linen swatches with linseed oil and sealing them. Within the same day, temperatures rose above 300 degrees or 680 degrees Fahrenheit, producing smoke and smoldering embers. This demonstrated that spontaneous combustion had occurred within the mummy itself, most likely inside the airtight coffin. Far from being deliberate desecration, this fire-like charring was a tragic result of botched embalming. In fact, it's the only case among royal mummies where such internal burning was observed. Some items in the burial, like the crook and flail, were degraded. Resin scarabs were cracked, and the mummy was adhered so tightly to its coffin that conservators later resorted to chiseling the body out and even splitting the torso horizontally to extract remains. What emerges is a portrait of a troubled burial, a young, physically compromised king struck down by a fatal accident and possibly deadly infection. His body wrapped in copious oils and sealed before the embalming had been completed. When examined centuries later, the mummy's appearance reinforced this chaotic origin. Carter described the flesh as like soot and charred powder. The mask and mummy had fused to the coffin's lining, necessitating extreme measures like scalpels and hot knives to remove them. Fragments of medieval preservation procedures, such as hot paraffin wax used on disarticulated limbs, were later added during repair efforts. Despite the burial's evident dysfunction, the sheer volume of artifacts, over 5,398 items, including amulets, statues, canopic jars, and chariots, reveals that immense resources were still deployed. Yet even this grandeur couldn't hide the underlying disorder. Mismatched coffins, incomplete wall paintings, reused funerary gear, and an embalming process that failed in one of the most critical aspects, preserving the heart. So, what about the curse and those deaths? Fact versus fiction. Was there a curse? Despite its dramatic reputation, the so-called Curse of the Pharaohs is a myth. When British archaeologist Howard Carter uncovered the tomb of Tutankhamun in 1922, headlines around the world quickly began to link the deaths of those associated with the discovery to an ancient curse. The theory gained public traction after the sudden death of George Herbert, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, the expedition's financier, on April 5, 1923. He died of blood poisoning that developed from a mosquito bite, exacerbated by pneumonia and chronic health problems, including injuries from a previous car accident. While the timing of his death shortly after the tomb's opening appeared suspicious to some, medical experts and publications like The Lancet pointed out that there was no evidence to support supernatural causes or exotic diseases stemming from the tomb. Of the approximately 58 individuals present when the sarcophagus was opened, only 8 died within the subsequent 12 years. Most were elderly or already in poor health. A 2002 study published in the British Medical Journal found no statistically significant increase in mortality among those who had been exposed to the tomb. Figures often cited as victims of the curse, such as Sir Archibald Douglas Reed and Arthur Mace, died of conditions like pneumonia or complications from toxic exposure. These ailments were common for the era and consistent with their known medical histories. Howard Carter himself, arguably the most exposed individual to the tomb and its contents, lived for another 16 years, dying in 1939 of lymphoma at age 64. His longevity and continued work in Egyptology cast further doubt on the notion of a curse. Nevertheless, public figures like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes, added fuel to the fire by claiming the curse was real. Ancient Egyptian beliefs, often misrepresented in the popular curse narrative, offer no evidence that such spells were designed to affect tomb raiders millennia in the future. While there were execration rituals in ancient times, they were typically political, aimed at enemies of the state rather than supernatural traps for grave robbers. Furthermore, inscriptions commonly attributed to Tutankhamun's tomb warning of death to intruders, such as "Death comes on swift wings to him who disturbs the king's rest," are purely fictional. What followed the discovery in 1922 was a perfect storm of mystery, misfortune, and media sensationalism. The 1920s public, reeling from the traumas of the First World War and increasingly interested in the occult, was eager for supernatural explanations. A power outage in Cairo that occurred around the time of Carnarvon's death, as well as the sudden death of his dog in England, added to the lore, even though there was no direct connection to the tomb. Sensationalist newspapers and public figures alike seized on these eerie coincidences to push the idea of a curse. In the decades that followed, more grounded theories emerged to explain the cluster of health problems linked to ancient tombs. Some suggested microbial contamination, such as mold spores, specifically Aspergillus, which can cause respiratory infections in immunocompromised individuals, might have been responsible. A 1998 letter published in The Lancet revisited this theory. Others posited that toxic substances like ammonia, formaldehyde, or even radiation might be present in sealed burial chambers. A 2024 fringe hypothesis claimed that Tutankhamun's tomb had elevated levels of radioactivity, but no credible evidence has been presented to support this. Egyptologists and medical experts continue to emphasize that no consistent pattern of illness has ever been documented in visitors or researchers exposed to King Tut's tomb. Even with all these logical explanations, the myth of the mummy's curse refuses to die. It plays into deep-seated human fascinations with death, the afterlife, and the unknown. Some scholars have argued that the myth may have had practical uses in the past. The suggestion of a supernatural punishment may have discouraged potential tomb robbers at a time when archaeological sites were vulnerable to looting, particularly in the unstable political landscape of post-colonial Egypt. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching. Did you like this video? If you did, please consider liking, dropping a comment, and hitting the subscribe button so that you don't miss out on our new uploads. Also, don't miss this video you see on your screen right now. It's truly unbelievable.